When we think about Elvis Presley, most of us picture the young man in the 1950s, slick hair, leather jacket, hips moving in ways television executives thought were too inappropriate for family audiences. He was the symbol of youth, rebellion, and raw talent. But by 1977, the Elvis the world saw looked very different, and the truth behind that transformation is where this story really begins. At this point in his life, Elvis was still a superstar. His concerts sold out, his name alone guaranteed headlines, and fans still treated him like royalty. But the man himself was struggling in ways most people couldn't see. Years of relentless touring had left his body battered. He wasn't just a singer anymore, he was a machine, expected to perform night after night, city after city, no matter how exhausted he was. And that exhaustion ran deep. By the mid-70s, Elvis's health had begun to spiral. Reports later revealed that he was dependent on a staggering cocktail of prescription drugs, everything from painkillers to sleeping pills to stimulants just to keep him moving. His personal doctor, George Nichopoulos, admitted after Elvis's death that in his final year, Elvis had been prescribed more than 10,000 pills. 10,000 pills. Just imagine the toll that takes on a body. And it showed. The sharp jawline that once made women scream had softened. The lean frame that electrified stages had filled out. And yet, none of that mattered to his fans. If anything, it made them love him even more, because when Elvis walked on stage, even in 1977, he was still the king. He could still command a room with a single note, still make thousands of people forget everything else for a few hours. But behind the curtain, it was a different story. Friends and crew members noticed he was often tired, sometimes even disoriented. His schedule didn't give him much room to rest, and emotionally, he was carrying the weight of being Elvis Presley 24/7. Imagine having the entire world expecting you to always be larger than life, even when you feel completely broken on the inside. What makes this even more heartbreaking is the contrast. If you looked at photos of Elvis in 1956, when Heartbreak Hotel first hit the charts, and then compared them to images from 1977, it was almost like looking at two different men. And yet, the soul, the voice, the connection with the audience, that never really left him. That's why this last concert is so powerful. Because by the summer of 1977, Elvis was at his most fragile, but he was also at his most human. His fans weren't cheering for the picture-perfect rock and roll idol anymore. They were cheering for a man they loved, flaws and all. They were cheering for Elvis, the person, not just the legend. And that's the stage we need to set before we talk about that final night. Because to really understand the magic and the heartbreak of his last performance, you have to see where Elvis was in those final months, adored by millions, but silently carrying battles nobody in the audience could fully see. Indianapolis, June 26, 1977. Market Square Arena was alive hours before the show even started. Fans had been lining up since the afternoon, clutching homemade signs, programs, and in some cases, old vinyl records they hoped to get signed. This wasn't just another concert, this was Elvis Presley. Even after 2 decades at the top, his presence alone was enough to turn a regular summer night into history in the making. Picture the scene, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of concession stand popcorn. Teenagers dressed in sequins and bell-bottoms. Middle-aged couples who had grown up with Elvis back in the 50s, now bringing their kids to show them the legend. People weren't just excited, they were buzzing, like they were about to witness something sacred. Inside the arena, the energy was electric. Lights dimmed, fans screamed, and every time someone spotted a movement backstage, the noise rose another notch. Elvis hadn't even walked out yet, and the crowd was already on fire. But behind the curtains, the mood was very different. Elvis wasn't the wide-eyed kid from Memphis anymore, bouncing with energy before a show. By 1977, the minutes before stepping on stage were harder for him. Friends later recalled that he often looked drained, sometimes even dazed, before pulling himself together at the last possible second. That night was no exception. Backstage, Elvis adjusted his iconic white jumpsuit, the one with glittering rhinestones that sparkled under the spotlight. He looked tired, yes, but he was still Elvis. He still had that quiet aura that could silence a room. And when the announcer's booming voice called, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley," something seemed to shift inside him. Almost like muscle memory. The fatigue melted away, replaced by the performer the world had known for decades. It's important to remember that nobody in that building, not the fans, not the crew, not even Elvis himself, had any idea this would be his final concert. To them, it was just another night of Elvis magic. But looking back, that detail makes every second of the build-up feel heavier, more significant. Imagine being a fan in the front row. You've saved up for months, maybe even traveled from out of town, just to see him. You've heard the rumors in the tabloids: Elvis was sick, Elvis was past his prime, Elvis wasn't the same anymore. And then, suddenly, the lights go out. The first notes of the orchestra hit. The arena explodes with cheers. And there he is. The king, walking out in that jumpsuit, hair perfectly styled, holding the microphone like a sword. Whatever doubts anyone had vanished in an instant. The audience wasn't thinking about his health or his struggles. They weren't seeing the man who was tired backstage just minutes earlier. They were seeing Elvis Presley, live, in front of them, larger than life, ready to give them one more unforgettable night. That's the power of this moment. The anticipation, the roar of the crowd, the way Elvis could flip a switch and become the king again. And all of it set the stage for what would turn out to be one of the most hauntingly beautiful performances of his life. When Elvis finally stepped into the spotlight that night in Indianapolis, the roar was deafening. Thousands of fans rose to their feet, clapping, screaming, and waving their arms like they were greeting an old friend. Elvis gave a small smile, nodded to the band, and the music kicked in. For the next 80 minutes, the man who had been worn down backstage was suddenly gone. In his place was the king of rock and roll, commanding the stage one last time. The set list that night was a mix of classics and fan favorites, songs that had defined different chapters of his career. He opened with the bombastic "CC Rider," a staple of his live shows, and from the first line, his voice carried through the arena with surprising power. It wasn't as smooth or effortless as in the 1950s, but it had a grit, or rawness, that almost made it more authentic. As the show went on, Elvis moved through a lineup that included "I Got a Woman," "Love Me," and "If You Love Me, Let Me Know." Fans sang along to every word, their voices joining his until it felt like the entire building was one massive choir. You could see people crying, couples hugging, teenagers screaming like it was still the 50s. Even in 1977, Elvis had a way of pulling everyone into his orbit. But some songs carried a different kind of weight that night. When he sang "Hurt," it didn't feel like just another performance. The way he delivered it was raw, almost painful, as if the lyrics were coming straight from his own life. Witnesses later said it was chilling. You could hear the struggle in his voice, but also his determination to give the crowd everything he had left. It was like Elvis was bearing his soul for those few minutes, and the audience could feel it. Another standout moment was his rendition of "Bridge Over Troubled Water." By then, his health was fragile, his movements slower, but when he sang that song, his voice soared. The arena grew quiet, almost reverent, as if everyone realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was emotionally devastating in the best way. And of course, the finale. Elvis closed the show with "Can't Help Falling in Love," a tradition in his concerts. As the opening notes began, fans instinctively rose to their feet. Many held hands, swaying together, some with tears streaming down their faces. There was something almost prophetic about it, the last song of his last concert being one of the most timeless love songs ever written. When he sang those final lines, his voice was softer, tender, almost like a personal farewell to the people who had stood by him all those years. By the time the band hit the last chord, the arena erupted. The crowd screamed his name, some reaching out toward the stage, others just standing frozen, trying to burn the image into their memory. Elvis gave a small bow, smiled faintly, and whispered into the microphone, "Thank you, good night." In that moment, nobody realized what they had just witnessed. To the fans, it was another unforgettable Elvis concert, powerful, emotional, larger than life. But looking back now, knowing this was his final performance, every song, every note, every smile carries a weight it didn't that night. It wasn't just a concert. It was Elvis Presley's last gift to the world. Here's the heartbreaking truth about that night: what the audience saw on stage in Indianapolis was only part of the story. Yes, Elvis sang with power. Yes, he gave his fans the magic they came for. But behind the rhinestone jumpsuit and the spotlight, he was a man in rapid decline. By 1977, Elvis's health was hanging by a thread. His body was ravaged by years of prescription drug abuse, painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, sometimes all in the same day. His personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolos, would later admit that in the final year of Elvis's life, he had prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of pills. 10,000. That staggering number tells you everything about how dependent he had become just to function. And the cost was showing. His once athletic frame had grown bloated. His energy drained quickly. Friends who were with him on tour recalled that he would often struggle to stay awake, sometimes even nodding off mid-conversation. There were nights when he needed help just to get dressed in the iconic jumpsuits he wore on stage. But here's the thing that makes that last concert so bittersweet: despite all of that, he still stepped out and gave his fans everything he could. The public saw the king, confident and powerful. What they didn't see was the fragile man who walked back off stage, exhausted and hurting. It's not an exaggeration to say Elvis was living two lives in those final months. On stage, he was a legend. Off stage, he was fighting to simply keep going. The crew, the band, even some of his closest friends admitted later that they knew he wasn't well, but no one realized just how close the end really was. Less than 2 months after that final performance, Elvis would be gone, found lifeless in his Graceland home at just 42 years old. Think about that for a second. The man who had changed music forever, who had electrified the world with his voice and his swagger, was younger than many of the people who were sitting in his audience that night. And yet, his body had been worn down far beyond his years. That's the truth the fans in Indianapolis couldn't see, and maybe that's what makes the concert even more haunting. Because the people in the arena that night weren't just watching a performance. They were unknowingly witnessing a farewell. Looking back now, it's almost eerie. When Elvis sang songs like Hurt or Bridge Over Troubled Water, they sounded less like performances and more like confessions. Almost as if, on some level, he knew time was running out. Of course, nobody can say for certain what was in his mind that night, but the emotion in his voice tells a story words can't capture. And maybe that's what makes the heartbreak so real. Elvis gave everything he had left in that final concert, not just the polished showmanship, but the last sparks of a flame that had once burned brighter than anyone else's. To the fans, it was magic. To history, it was the final chapter of a man who had given his life to music, even when it was slowly taking everything from him. When the final notes of Can't Help Falling in Love faded into the night air, Market Square Arena erupted. Fans were on their feet, clapping, screaming, begging for more. Some threw flowers toward the stage, others just stood frozen, trying to take in the moment. To them, this was another triumphant Elvis finale, the kind of ending they'd brag about for years to come. Elvis gave a small smile, bowed his head, and whispered into the microphone, "Thank you, good night." Those were his last words to an audience. Simple. Quiet. Almost understated, considering the magnitude of his career. But maybe that's what made it so powerful. There was no dramatic farewell, no hint that this was the end. Just a man, exhausted but grateful, saying goodnight to the people who loved him. As he turned and walked off the stage, the applause followed him like a wave. But once he disappeared behind the curtain, the illusion began to fade. Crew members later recalled that Elvis looked drained. His steps were slower, his shoulders heavy. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance slipped away almost immediately. One stagehand remembered that Elvis barely spoke on the way back to his dressing room, as if all his energy had been spent out there under the lights. For the band and the crew, it felt like any other night. They had no idea that history had just been made, that they had all witnessed the last time Elvis Presley would ever perform live. To them, it was just another tour stop, another city on the schedule. The plan was to rest for a bit, then continue on to more shows in the coming weeks. Nobody could have predicted that less than 7 weeks later, the king would be gone. What makes this moment even more haunting is how ordinary it seemed. There were no dramatic collapses, no clear signs that this was the final curtain. Elvis finished the show, thanked the audience, and walked away. That was it. The chapter closed so quietly that most people didn't even realize they had seen history until it was too late. For the fans leaving Market Square Arena that night, the mood was pure joy. People spilled into the streets still buzzing from what they had just experienced. Couples held hands, kids begged their parents to buy them Elvis souvenirs, and older fans reminisced about seeing him back in the early days. Nobody was thinking, that's the last time. They were thinking, Elvis is still here, and he's still ours. And maybe that's the most heartbreaking part. Because if you had asked anyone that night, they would have told you Elvis Presley still had years of performances ahead of him. They would have said, the king isn't going anywhere. But history had other plans. That simple bow, that whispered thank you, good night, wasn't just the end of a concert. It was the final goodbye of one of the most iconic performers the world has ever known. Looking back on that night in Indianapolis, it's hard not to feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was just another Elvis concert, fans screaming, the band playing, the king giving them the magic they came for. On the other, it was the end of an era. Nobody in that building knew it, but they had just witnessed the last chapter of a story that had shaped music, culture, and generations. And that's the beauty, and the tragedy, of Elvis Presley's legacy. He was more than a singer. He was more than a performer. Elvis changed the way the world thought about music. Before him, rock and roll wasn't taken seriously. It was dismissed as a fad, something for teenagers that would fade away. But Elvis? He proved it could be something bigger, something powerful enough to unite people across race, class, and culture. Think about it, in the 1950s, when America was still deeply divided, here comes this young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, blending gospel, country, and rhythm and blues into something entirely new. People didn't even know what to call it at first. But they knew one thing, it made them feel alive. That was Elvis's gift, and that's why even in 1977, when his health was failing, his presence could still fill an arena. What makes his last concert so poignant is the contrast. The man on stage that night wasn't the flawless idol from the 1950s. He was human, vulnerable, imperfect, fighting battles behind the scenes. And yet, fans didn't care. They weren't there for perfection. They were there for Elvis. That's what makes a legacy last, when people love you not just for your peak moments, but for the heart you show even at your weakest. Historians often point out that Elvis's influence is everywhere, even today. You can hear echoes of his style in countless artists who came after him, from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to modern pop stars who still borrow his swagger, his showmanship, his ability to make every performance feel larger than life. His fingerprint is in the DNA of modern music. But maybe the most powerful part of his legacy isn't just the music, it's the connection. Fans who were in Market Square Arena that night often say they didn't feel like they were watching a distant star. They felt like Elvis was singing directly to them, as if he somehow saw each person in the crowd. That's rare. That's what makes legends. And so, when we think about that last concert, it's easy to focus on the sadness, the failing health, the quiet goodbye, the fact that weeks later he would be gone. But maybe it's better to look at it differently. Elvis's final performance wasn't about the end. It was about the fact that even at his lowest, he still gave his audience everything he had left. He didn't walk off early, he didn't hold back. He sang until the very last note, and in doing so, he gave his fans one final memory to treasure forever. That's why, decades later, Elvis Presley is still the king. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real, and because he left behind a legacy that proves some voices never truly fade. And that was Elvis Presley's last concert, a night that seemed like just another stop on tour, but turned out to be the final chapter in one of the greatest careers of all time. Fans left Market Square Arena that night thinking they'd see him again. Nobody knew that in just 7 weeks, the king would be gone. That's what makes it so haunting. It wasn't staged as a farewell. Elvis didn't make a dramatic exit. He simply sang, bowed, and whispered, "Thank you, good night." And maybe that's what makes it so perfect, because Elvis had always given everything to his fans, and his final words were pure gratitude. Looking back now, that concert reminds us of who Elvis really was. Not just the superstar, not just the icon, but a man who showed up for his fans, even when it cost him. That's why, decades later, he's still the king.